How did the British Empire amass unimaginable wealth? By looting Africa and India, of course. But the true cost of this empire's riches is darker than you think. Let's uncover the shocking truth behind Britain's colonial plunder. The empire's military might was not just in its ships, it was in its strategy. Divide and rule. In India, the British played rival kingdoms against each other. The East India Company recruited local soldiers, sepoys, to fight against their own countrymen. When the British defeated the powerful Mughal Empire in the 18th century, it wasn't just a victory of guns and cannons. It was a victory of manipulation. In Africa, the British exploited tribal conflicts, offering weapons to one group while suppressing another. By the time resistance leaders realized the true threat, British troops were already marching through their lands. Trade alone could not build an empire. To expand, the British needed force. Their navy, once a fleet of wooden ships, became the deadliest armada the world had ever seen. By the late 17th century, Britain's naval supremacy allowed it to dominate global trade routes. The Royal Navy was not just a means of defense. It was an instrument of expansion. Wherever British merchants went, warships followed. India, with its vast wealth and thriving markets, was first. The East India Company, acting as Britain's private army, secured its control through treaties, betrayals, and military victories. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked the beginning of British rule in India. What started as a business venture had become outright colonization, but the British thirst for expansion was unquenchable. In the 19th century, Africa became the next frontier. The so-called Scramble for Africa saw European powers carve up the continent like a map drawn in blood. Britain took control of vast territories: South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt. The Zulu, the Ashanti, the Sudanese all fought back. But Britain's firepower was unmatched. Rifles, machine guns, and artillery crushed resistance. In the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, British forces, using rapid-fire weapons, slaughtered over 10,000 Sudanese warriors in a single day. The British justified these conquests as bringing civilization to uncivilized lands. But in reality, it was a war for resources, labor, and control. For centuries, the British Empire was hailed as a force of civilization, a global power bringing trade, governance, and progress to the world. But beneath this grand narrative lies a darker reality. The empire was not built on diplomacy or benevolence. It was built on exploitation. The wealth of Britain, its grand palaces, its powerful economy, its industrial might, was fueled by the suffering of millions. Resources were stripped from colonized lands, entire industries were crushed, and people were enslaved, forced into labor, or left to starve. This is the untold story of how the empire extracted, exploited, and drained its colonies. A story of diamonds and gold, of sugar and cotton, of wealth stolen, and lives destroyed. The British first came to India as traders. By the 18th century, they had become rulers. But their rule was not for the benefit of India. It was for the economic gain of Britain. The East India Company imposed heavy taxes on local farmers, forcing them to grow cash crops like opium and indigo instead of food. The result? Famine. In 1770, Bengal, a region once known for its prosperity, was ravaged by starvation. British policies had drained the land's wealth, and when drought struck, there was no relief. The British continued to demand taxes even as people lay dying in the streets. 10 million people perished. But while India suffered, Britain thrived. Indian textiles, once the finest in the world, were deliberately destroyed by British policies. Indian weavers were banned from competing with British factories, and tariffs crushed local industry. The once booming Indian economy collapsed, and millions were forced into poverty. India had become a colony not just of land, but of labor and wealth. The British Empire saw Africa not as a home for nations, but as a treasure chest. Diamonds, gold, rubber, riches buried beneath the soil, waiting to be extracted. In South Africa, the discovery of gold and diamonds in the late 19th century sparked a frenzy. British businessmen, backed by the empire's military, took control of vast mines. African workers were forced into grueling labor, digging in dangerous conditions for a fraction of the wealth they uncovered. In the Congo, under European rule, the demand for rubber led to unspeakable brutality. Indigenous workers were beaten, mutilated, or killed if they failed to meet their quotas. The profits flowed to Europe, while the people of Africa paid the price. Even agriculture was turned against the people. British policies forced African farmers to grow crops for export, coffee, cotton, tea, rather than food. The result? Widespread hunger. By the 20th century, Africa had been stripped of its wealth. The natural riches of the land had filled British pockets, while the people of Africa remained impoverished and exploited. The empire took everything and gave nothing in return. Perhaps the greatest crime of the British Empire was not just the theft of resources, but the theft of human lives. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, Britain was at the center of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured, shackled, and shipped across the Atlantic in brutal conditions. Crammed into the holds of ships, they endured starvation, disease, and abuse. Many never survived the journey. Those who did arrived in the Caribbean, where British plantations grew sugar, the empire's most valuable commodity. Under the blistering sun, enslaved Africans were beaten, tortured, and worked to death to produce the sugar that sweetened British tea. For the British economy, slavery was a source of vast wealth. Banks, insurance companies, and politicians all profited. Even after slavery was formally abolished in 1833, the British government compensated slave owners, not the enslaved people. So was abolition a moral awakening, or just an economic shift? By the 19th century, industrial Britain no longer needed slavery. It needed free markets, new ways to exploit labor without outright ownership. So slavery ended, but exploitation remained. The system had changed, but the suffering continued.